Putin was supposed to unveil power. Instead, he unveiled absence. No endless armor columns, no overwhelming mechanized spectacle, no image of unstoppable momentum, just a shortened parade, thin formations, nervous optics, and somewhere far from Moscow, Ukrainian drones were already rewriting the story. That was the real problem facing Vladimir Putin in May 2026. Not symbolism, reality. Because while Russian state television tried to broadcast confidence to the world, the battlefield itself was broadcasting something completely different: exhaustion. For months, the Kremlin promised that the spring offensive would finally break Ukraine's defenses in the Donbass. Russian military bloggers talked about momentum. Officials talked about inevitability. State media framed the coming campaign as the operation that would finally crush Ukrainian resistance and secure the Donetsk region before the end of the year. But the deeper analysts looked into the battlefield picture, the stranger the situation became. Russia was still advancing, technically, but the speed of those gains was becoming almost surreal. Entire offensives were consuming years just to seize individual urban areas already devastated by artillery and drone warfare. Russian formations were taking catastrophic casualties for tiny territorial changes measured not in strategic breakthroughs, but in kilometers. And worse still for Moscow, Ukraine had stopped reacting to Russian tempo. Ukraine was starting to dictate it. That is the shift that matters, because wars are not decided only by territory, they are decided by initiative. And by early 2026, there were growing signs that Russia was losing control of the operational rhythm of the war itself. The warning signs appeared across the front. Russian assaults around the Donetsk defensive network continued grinding forward with massive artillery support, infantry waves, and constant drone coverage. But the gains were inconsistent. Assault groups infiltrated villages and industrial zones. Some positions changed hands repeatedly. Others became grey zones where neither side fully controlled the ground. The Kremlin still demanded results, especially in Donetsk. That demand created pressure throughout the Russian command structure. Pressure to keep attacking regardless of cost, pressure to feed reserves into attritional battles, pressure to show progress before politically important dates. And that pressure collided with a battlefield environment that had fundamentally changed, because Ukraine was no longer trying to simply absorb Russian attacks. It was bleeding them, systematically. What made this especially dangerous for Russia was not any single Ukrainian breakthrough. It was accumulation, communication failures, drone attrition, logistics disruption, reserve shortages, fuel pressure, constant strikes behind the line. Each problem fed the next, and once that cycle started, it became extremely difficult to stop. One of the most important developments happened far from the trenches themselves. Russian units had relied heavily on improvised communications ecosystems throughout the war. Some systems were military-grade, others were patched together through civilian infrastructure, commercial devices, encrypted applications, and illicit access to satellite communications. Then those systems started collapsing. Reports throughout early 2026 described severe disruptions in Russian battlefield coordination after efforts intensified to shut down unauthorized access to satellite communication networks. At nearly the same time, domestic restrictions on digital platforms inside Russia created additional strain on information sharing among frontline personnel. The result was operational friction. Orders slowed, reconnaissance degraded, targeting coordination suffered, frontline adaptation became harder. And on a modern battlefield saturated with drones, artillery, and rapid kill chains, even small communication delays become lethal. Ukraine understood this, and it began exploiting it aggressively, especially in the south. While Russian forces remained heavily committed to the grinding campaigns around the Donetsk defensive belt, Ukrainian forces increasingly focused on stretching Russian operational priorities across multiple sectors simultaneously. That created a dilemma for Moscow. Every reserve battalion sent toward offensive operations in Donetsk became unavailable elsewhere. Every reinforcement moved south weakened pressure in the east. Every logistical asset redirected to stabilize one sector exposed another. The battlefield stopped functioning like a single front. It became a competition of exhaustion, and Ukraine was learning how to manipulate that exhaustion. This is where the war became deeply humiliating for the Kremlin, because Russia was still paying the price of offensive warfare at industrial scale. Casualty estimates climbed relentlessly. Drone footage flooded social media daily. Entire assault groups vanished in open fields under FPV strikes. Supply trucks exploded on rear roads. Artillery systems were hunted by coordinated reconnaissance networks. Even armored advances became increasingly dangerous because modern drone surveillance made concealment extraordinarily difficult. The result: Russia was spending manpower at a rate that alarmed even pro-Russian military commentators. And the numbers became impossible to ignore. Daily casualty estimates regularly exceeded 1,000 personnel. Entire months reportedly produced losses in the tens of thousands. Meanwhile, territorial gains often remained marginal. That ratio matters, because attritional warfare only works when losses generate strategic momentum. If they do not, attrition becomes self-destruction. And there were growing signs that Russian offensive capacity was beginning to encounter exactly that problem. Then came the logistics war. This part receives less attention than dramatic frontline footage, but it may be the most important factor of all. Ukraine expanded medium-range drone operations deep behind Russian lines, not symbolic attacks, sustained disruption campaigns, fuel depots, rail nodes, vehicle concentrations, command facilities, air defense positions, repair infrastructure. The targets themselves mattered, but the secondary effects mattered even more, because modern offensives are not powered by courage alone. They are powered by fuel movement, maintenance cycles, ammunition delivery schedules, replacement vehicles, engineering assets, communications relays, and functioning transport corridors. Disrupt those systems consistently enough, and entire offensives slow down. That slowdown was becoming visible. Russian assaults increasingly lacked sustained exploitation after initial gains. Units seized positions but struggled to expand breakthroughs. Operational tempo became uneven, momentum stalled, then stalled again. And while this was happening, Ukraine was also escalating long-range pressure inside Russia itself. Oil infrastructure became a repeated target. Refineries, storage facilities, export nodes, energy logistics. The purpose was not merely destruction, it was strategic pressure. Even politically symbolic moments started backfiring for Moscow. The Victory Day ceasefire announcement was intended to project authority and moral positioning. Instead, it exposed confusion. Both sides accused each other of violations. Operations slowed in some sectors while continuing in others. Drone strikes and artillery exchanges never fully disappeared. The battlefield simply refused to obey a political theater. Then another deeply uncomfortable problem emerged for the Kremlin: Kursk. Russian officials repeatedly framed operations there as stabilized and contained. Yet Ukrainian forces continued demonstrating activity linked to the region, keeping pressure alive politically and militarily. That carried symbolic weight far beyond the actual geography involved. Because the existence of continued Ukrainian operational reach inside or near Russian territory undermined one of the Kremlin's most important narratives: restored control. Which brings us back to that parade. The event itself was supposed to communicate certainty. Military parades are strategic messaging operations. They exist to project abundance, strength, readiness, confidence. Instead, observers noticed reduced equipment displays, heightened security concerns, and a more constrained atmosphere than previous years. Foreign attendance reportedly declined. Some major partners appeared noticeably distant. And perhaps most damaging of all, the visual symbolism collided directly with battlefield reality already circulating online. Destroyed vehicles, drone strikes, burning depots, attritional assaults. The contrast was devastating. Because modern wars are no longer controlled exclusively by state television. They are fought in information space every hour. A single drone video can destroy weeks of propaganda. A single satellite image can expose an entire narrative. And Ukraine has become exceptionally skilled at weaponizing visibility. That does not mean Ukraine is winning outright. Far from it. Ukraine still faces enormous strain: manpower pressure, ammunition requirements, infrastructure damage, economic dependency, constant missile threats. This remains a brutal war of attrition with enormous uncertainty ahead. But that uncertainty itself is now one of Russia's biggest problems. The Kremlin did not launch this war to fight indefinitely for marginal gains under escalating economic and military pressure. It launched expecting decisive dominance. Instead, it found itself trapped inside a long, industrial conflict where adaptation matters more than mass alone. And Ukraine adapted faster than many expected, especially in drone warfare, in decentralized battlefield coordination, in targeting rear area vulnerability, in turning relatively cheap systems into strategic-level pressure. What happens when an army can still attack, but can no longer accelerate? That is the question hanging over Russia now. Because offensives depend on momentum, and momentum depends on systems that are increasingly under stress. The Russian military still possesses enormous firepower. It remains dangerous. It can still devastate cities and pressure Ukrainian defenses across a massive front. But the image of unstoppable expansion has cracked. The battlefield no longer supports it, and once that perception changes internationally, politically, and psychologically, restoring it becomes extraordinarily difficult, especially when every month produces more drone footage, more attritional losses, and more evidence of a war drifting further from the rapid victory once promised. That may become the true legacy of this phase of the war. Not one catastrophic collapse, not one decisive battle, but the slow public exposure of strategic limits. An exposure visible not only in ruined columns and contested trenches, but in something far more symbolic. A parade designed to showcase dominance, that instead revealed anxiety. And the most dangerous part for the Kremlin is this: Ukraine appears to understand exactly where those anxieties now live. That is why the next stage of the war could become even more consequential than the last. Because once a military loses control of tempo, it risks losing control of the story itself. And in modern warfare, story shapes everything, including how wars end, including how leaders are remembered, including how empires fade. One parade cannot hide that forever.